Yeah. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, friends from different time zones. A very warm welcome to each one of you who are attending this Asia Pacific Knowledge Sharing webinar on deep sea mining. We are extremely delighted to have with us an expert panel, and I'm sure listening to them will be very empowering. Before we begin, a few housekeeping rules that I would like to share. Please keep your microphones on mute unless you are speaking. We'll open for questions only after the panelists have spoken. However, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box or select the raise hand option to ask questions, and we will announce your name and will ask you to unmute. But please keep your questions concise. Please use the chat box for questions and comments only. And we promised that we would be going for the Hindi interpretation, but there is some technical problem, and we are very sorry that that won't be probably happening. And we're trying our best to kind of summarize it in Hindi and share it with you in the chat box. So before I hand over the mic to Chadwick, I would like to share a 2-minute video to hear from one of the members of the Alliance of Solwara Warriors, Jonathan Musalem from Papua New Guinea, who's been campaigning against deep sea mining since 2011. Let me just share the screen.
And I have an organization known as the West Coast Development Foundation, which is a member of the Alliance of Solwara Warriors, and we are established to fight or campaign against deep sea mining. Right in Papua New Guinea, in 2007, the provincial national government gave the mining company Nautilus Minerals the exploration license, and in 2011 the mining license. We have campaigned against this project since 2011 upwards, for the purpose that being our livelihood depends entirely on the sea. We depend on the fish, marine products for our daily survival. So, since 2011 till now, we have been campaigning against deep sea mining. There are several reasons for that, and one is this environmental impact. There's no one, right? Even the scientists, the company, the government knows the impact of the deep sea mining project. The second is the economical impact, right? We have fisheries that is a sustainable and renewable resource that will be affected by the seabed mining project. The third reason that we oppose seabed mining is because of our cultural connection with the sea. The project site, the Solwara 1 project site, is situated in one of our cultural area, that is the Sakoling culture. So we are afraid that once this project goes ahead, it might affect, it can have an impact on our cultural connection. So from our end, we say no to seabed mining.
So this pretty much sets the context. And I would like to quote a statement made by the Pacific Blue Line Collective that says, as custodians to protect our ocean against its exploitation and destruction, we have a moral obligation and a long-standing legacy to uphold. It is our common heritage, but also our common responsibility. We are its guardians. We recognize its significance and its essence as the basis of our Pacific identity and well-being. We are the ocean. In its preservation, we are preserved. So let me now take a second to introduce Chadwick, who would be facilitating this panel. Chadwick is Publish What You Play Global Council member representing the Asia Pacific region. He's also associated with Bantakita PWIP Philippines. His active pursuits in connection to this responsibility include indigenous peoples' inclusion initiatives in natural resource governance, as well as engagements with the local government of the province of Cebu for the subnational implementation of Philippines EITI, particularly intended for the participation of the vulnerable sectors, farmers, fisherfolks, and women. He has earlier represented the CSO constituency to the Philippines EITI MSG and is also the CSO representative to the Provincial Mining Regulatory Board, the local oversight body for small scale mining under Philippine laws. Over to you, Chadwick.
Good morning, Suswati. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be with these wonderful people in the room. I'm not going to be lengthy about the introductions though, but today, as your concept note did say, we are celebrating the International Human Rights Day, as well as the anniversary of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. If it isn't very timely for this discussion. Within Publish What You Pay, as well as, of course, within MIRA, because I'm seeing MIRA as the lead organization sending out beautiful information regarding deep sea mining, and we owe that to MIRA a lot. We look at deep sea mining right now as closely associated to an Asia-Pacific major discourse regarding energy transition, and this is what this afternoon, today is all about. And we will be joined by very important panelists. I'd like to introduce them one by one. We have in the panel Ms. Helen Rosenbaum, who's actually the campaign coordinator for deep sea mining. She's based in Australia, and her extensive work in research, participatory mechanisms, focus group discussions, makes her a very important voice in the discussions pertaining to deep sea mining and what are its implications. She's also joined with Ms. Claire Slatter, who's the founding member of the Pacific Blue Light Collective. I've had very good conversation with 3 panelists a few days ago, and wow, it's an awesome, respectful feeling I have towards them. She also is with the Development Alternatives with Women for New Era, or DAWN, which is a scholarly feminist activist group based in Fiji. And her topic on the political implications and civil society participation in deep sea mining would be an eye-opener also for all of us interested, particularly in holding on to that civic space we have, particularly in the very challenging times of the pandemic. And then, of course, there is Duncan Curry, who is the steering group member of the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, and he is based in New Zealand. He would be talking to us about the what do you call this one? The global perspective, basically concepts surrounding deep sea mining. So without going further on into the descriptions that I'm saying right now, may I ask you all to look at the program. It's supposed to be a 45-minute panel discussion, and I'm going to start with. We're still doing the order according to the program, Swati. So we'll begin with Duncan, because he will present to us the basic orientation of what deep sea mining is. So my call on
Chadwick.
Yes.
Yeah, I think Helen would be going first.
Okay. So
followed by Claire and then Duncan. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. I might probably be, but then again, yes, Claire, Helen, and then Duncan. So Helen, Claire,
Helen.
and Duncan. Yeah, okay. Helen, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I share my screen now, Saswati?
Sure, please do.
Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, Helen.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be able to share the knowledge we do have. I'm not sure that we're as important as Chadwick seems to think. We're a bunch of hardworking activists, like I think all of you on this call are. And I think you're equally well qualified. In fact, I'm a little bit daunted by I think the qualifications of the participants here. But anyway, I'd just like to quickly introduce the small campaign that I coordinate. We started off with a focus on Solwara 1, the very mine that you just heard Jonathan talk about in the video. We started our campaign about 11 years ago in response to the concerns that we heard from communities in Papua New Guinea. So when I say we, I guess I co-founded the campaign with Catherine Koomans from Mining Watch Canada, and I'd been working as a consultant to different organisations, NGOs in Papua New Guinea. Are we okay? Sorry. Should I just continue?
Yeah, sorry about that. Please continue.
Okay. Yes, so through the opportunities I had from doing consultancy work, I came into contact with community members from the area that Jonathan comes from and from another area, another set of islands, Duke of York Islands and East New Britain, which all of these islands surround the Bismarck Sea, which was the proposed site for Solwara 1, the proposed mine by the Canadian company Nautilus. Working together with Jonathan and also with other Papua New Guinean NGOs, we were quite successful, I think, in contributing to Nautilus becoming bankrupt in 2019. The campaign, however, continues within Papua New Guinea because we don't know what the fate of those licenses are. It's a transparency issue. We don't know who owns those licenses right now. And Jonathan and the Alliance of Solwara Warriors are campaigning to have those licenses cancelled. One of the other things our campaign puts a lot of energy into is producing science-based reports, and this is a selection of some of our reports. And I'd encourage anyone who's interested in finding out more about deep sea mining and to take a look at these reports. And in fact, what I'll be talking about today will comes out of a mix of these reports. Sorry, there we go. Just to also bring home the message even further about the strong connection between Pacific Islanders and the ocean. And I know Claire will definitely speak to this as well. You know, it was a real learning for me to meet this young man from Duke of York Islands, which is only, as I said, you know, it's quite close to the proposed Solwara 1 site. It's only 40 kilometres away from that proposed site. And he felt so connected to the dolphin pod that visits his bay every day that when one of the dolphins that he knew very well died, he buried that dolphin in his best and only Sunday clothes right next to his house He told me that he felt like he'd lost a family member. So to me, that was a real education about just how strong and how deep these connections are. So what is deep sea mining? Well, perhaps before I discuss that, it's important to note that nowhere in the world has any commercial deep sea mine begun yet. There's still, which is why we still have this hope that we can stop this latest threat to the oceans, to oceans that we all know are already under threat, and the resilience of our world oceans is being so, seriously tested by so many other kinds of impacts. So we still do have, as a global society, a window of opportunity. It's closing, and I think some of what Duncan will speak about shows that our action is needed urgently, but we still do have a window of opportunity to stop this form of extraction before it starts. So there are three types of ore body that mining companies are most interested in. The type of ore body that the company Nautilus was after in the Bismarck Sea at Solwara 1 that Jonathan referred to, a massive seafall massive sulfides. They're produced by hydrothermal vents, which are like these underwater mini volcanoes or geysers. And there's a photo on the top there of how these massive sulfides are actually formed. They're these geysers over thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, spew out this black ash, and in this black ash is it's a sulfidic ash, and it forms these big mounds around the vents, and it's within that ash that the minerals that the companies are interested are located. There's also cobalt-rich crusts, which sit on top of underwater mountains called seamounts, and polymetallic nodules, which occur on the very deep sea floor. And I'm going to focus on a particular area of the Pacific, where there's really a frenzy of exploration activity at the moment for these polymetallic nodules. So this area of the Pacific Ocean stretches about 5,500 kilometres across from Hawaii and Kiribati to Mexico. And as you can see in this picture, it's just a patchwork of exploration licenses that have been granted to companies. There's a whole range of different entities, private consortia, government company partnerships, governments. And so this whole area of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, this area is called, or CCZ, it's roughly about the size of Europe. And so not only does this diagram show the licenses that have already been granted, but it also shows areas, and I think, I can't read my slide very well, but it's one of the yellow coloured areas where that are the areas still reserved for new licenses to be granted. So this area of the CCZ, if the companies get their way, it's just about to become the biggest mining operation in the world's history, right on the back doorstep of Pacific Island countries. So who grants these licenses? In this area of international waters, it's the International Seabed Authority, and Duncan will be speaking more about them. Within the territorial waters of governments, within the exclusive economic zones, it's national governments. And I know Claire will be talking about some of the things going on at national government level in the Pacific. So what do we know about deep sea ecosystems? Well, the answer is we know very little. It's very expensive to research down there in the deep. And one problem civil society has had is there's very little independent science, because it's up till now, it's been largely the mining companies or the ISA that has a vested interest in the mining going ahead, that has paid for the research. So the things we do know about the deep sea ecosystems of the CCZ is that these polymetallic nodules, these cricket ball sort of shaped lumps of rock that the companies are after, they take millions of years to form. No one knows exactly how they form. There's various theories about how they form. And no one actually knows exactly what they do, but we don't assume they do nothing. Like, there have been various hypotheses put forward that they may be important for the chemistry of the ocean, that there may be some kind of exchange in minerals or other substances that help balance the pH of the ocean. So therefore, their removal may have unknown impacts. The organisms that live down in the deep sea are very strange, weird and wonderful critters. They're adapted to very extreme conditions down there, very high pressures, very low temperatures, and very, very dark, totally dark. So a lot of the organisms bioluminesce. That means they produce their own light so that they can actually hunt and communicate with each other. The deep sea seabed of the CCZ is like a really thick layer of thick mud. So the nodules form the only hard surfaces that organisms can attach to. So organisms like this thing, I have to admit, I don't actually know what it is. Maybe some deep underwater coral. They really depend on these polymetallic nodules as a surface to adhere to. We know that other species use the nodules as breeding grounds and feeding grounds, and there are there are more things we don't know about the deep sea than things we do know. But one thing science tells us is that we can predict that the mining of these polymetallic nodules will create very long-term impacts, perhaps permanent in human timescales. It will cause the loss of biodiversity and the extinction of species. And for those species that actually depend on those nodules, it basically removes them out of the ecosystem. So the different sources of impacts that we may expect from deep sea mining, and this slide here is borrowed from some friends at Ocean Care who have just released a report on the impacts of noise from deep sea mining. So this one is, these diagrams are more geared towards showing the noise impacts. But basically, we don't know exactly how deep sea mining is going to occur. I'll show you in a minute a slide that of a prototype mining vehicle machine that's been trialed. But the basic schema is that there will be these huge machines weighing about 80 tonnes on the seafloor. In the case of nodules, somehow collecting these nodules. In the case of other surfaces, cutting and grinding those surfaces. And that ore body, those substances will then be transported to a big pipe called a riser pipe, from where they will be pumped up to the surface. So these nodules on these deep plains called abyssal plains in the CCZ, they're 3 to 6 kilometres below the surface. So you can just imagine the kinds of risks that a 3 to 6 kilometre long pipe might be subjected to, especially in a situation where climate change is increasing the strength and frequency of different weather events. There could be leakage from all of those machinery and the support equipment. But perhaps, perhaps most important of these impacts are the direct impacts that these vessels, these mining machines are going to have on the surface of the seabed, but also the plumes that they're going to generate. So clouds of sediment will be generated during the mining process right down at the sea surface. And also there will be plumes generated by the discharge of wastewater. So on the support ship that the nodules are pumped up to, we expect there'll be some kind of preliminary processing occurring on that ship, and there'll be wastewater discharged. Companies say they're likely to discharge it at about 1,000 kilometres depth. So we can expect currents to take that cloud of sediment and perhaps some kind of processing chemicals and maybe metals that have been released into the water through the preliminary processing. And they can be transported, depending on the sediment particle size, hundreds to thousands of kilometres. So within that that period before the plume settles, all sorts of creatures.
Helen,
yes.
Do you need more time? We have about 2 minutes to wrap up.
Oh, okay, all right. I'll go through this quickly. So. I'll move through this quite quickly, but I just think this issue of the impact of plumes is quite critical.
Of course.
So within that time period, the plumes will come into contact with all sorts of marine species, including fisheries that are important to humans, dolphins, whales, every kind of sea organism that we can think of. And no information has been released on what metals might be in that plume, whether they're going to be available in a chemical form for organisms to take up, and whether they might enter the food chain. So not only will the animals that come into direct contact with those metals be affected perhaps by their toxicity, but also those predators. And those predators also, of course, include the human predators. So here we have, just to give you an idea, a picture of the prototype that's being tested by the Belgian company GSR. And so you can, it just gives you an idea of the scale of this equipment. And this photo here just shows how, what a long time it takes for the seabed to recover. This is a photo taken from an experiment where 30 years earlier, a much lighter machine than this Patania 2 was run over the, crisscrossed over the surface of the CCZ seabed. And 30 years later, you can still see the tracks. You can see there's been absolutely no recovery. Some of the creatures that might come into contact with plumes include things like animals like this whale shark, which is already on the IUCN Red List. And also, as our friends at Ocean Care illustrate, all sorts of animals are going to be affected by noise generated by all of that infrastructure. The Pacific tuna fisheries are valuable fisheries worth about $1 billion, and it's likely to be impacted by plumes from deep sea mining, as are all fisher folk, including down to local level fisher folk, such as these people in East New Britain island of Papua New Guinea. The mining companies like to spin that deep sea mining is important to a transition to carbon neutral, and I'll let Duncan pick up on the arguments why that isn't the case. And why would you believe them anyway? This is Gerard Barron, who is head of, well, it was the Deep Green, is now called the Metals Company. And this is a direct quote from Gerard. Whether you invest in a company like Deep Green or not, everyone is a sucker for the story. So just to finish off, I'd like to say that us as a campaign, the Deep Sea Mining Campaign, we stand in solidarity with Pacific civil society organisations calling for a ban on deep sea mining. Thank you, and sorry if I've run over time.
Thank you, Helen. The information is very important. We can adjust. So I'll call Claire to be the next speaker for the panel. Claire. Claire, are we?
Can I share my screen?
Yes, Claire, of course.
Not really sure how to do this. I just go into...
The share screen button, a green one that you will find at the bottom of your screen. And then you will have an option to share your screen. That it would
share screen, got it. Okay, give me a second. Whoops, it's not desktop. Sorry, I'm not really it's PowerPoint.
You can...
Yep, I've just found it, I think.
Okay.
That it?
Right, and then...
Then how do I make this big?
This is strange. Slideshow, Claire, on top of,
right.
Yep. There.
Yep, got it.
Okay. Press that, and then you would see a few options again, and then again, please. Slideshow. Right, and then you would set up this one.
All right,
set up
from start.
From start.
Set up?
No, from start, please. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, let me begin by just greeting everyone. Namaste and Bola Vinaka from Fiji. And thank you to Saswati and to Chadwick and your organizations for this opportunity to speak with you today. I'm going to be speaking about political dynamics and civil society movements against DSM in the Pacific. After the really wonderfully detailed presentation by Helen, mine is going to be really quite slim, but I've got a lot of slides, not really. So let me begin by just saying, firstly, explaining why the Pacific Islands are a focus here. And the point is that unless we stop deep sea mining, and like Helen, I have a great hope that we may be able to stop it commencing, but if we don't do that, it will commence possibly in 2020. Forgetting to whip off my headphones because the speaker doesn't, the microphone doesn't work so well. Okay, so we have an issue in the Pacific because, and this is one of the reasons the Pacific Islands are a focus. The promise of mineral wealth from deep sea mining has proved to be too compelling a temptation for a handful of Pacific Island states who see mining in their EEZs as a sovereign right, and sponsoring mining, sponsoring companies to do mining in the CCZ as an entitlement to a fair share of the common heritage of humankind under UNCLOS. And Duncan is going to be speaking more about UNCLOS, so I won't go any further into that. But this is their kind of attitude, those Pacific Island states that are keen to mine the deep seabed. These states also believe the mining companies' spin on DSM, which is to say they believe that the base metals in the deep seabed are absolutely essential for a global transition from fossil fuels. They believe that DSM is therefore a solution to the climate crisis. And so they see themselves as contributing really to reducing global warming, which primarily affects them. They also have come to believe that DSM will be less harmful than terrestrial mining, which is what certainly Deep Green, the metals company, says, and that there's not much life on the deep seabed. So there's really not much in the way of environmental harm that's going to be caused. The fact that some of our states are pursuing deep sea mining, which is a risky experimental extractive industry in a region of the planet, which I think Helen has said, is only really beginning to be fully understood, not even fully understood, but we have so much still to learn about the deep sea ecosystems and so forth. This poses an especially challenging situation for those of us who are campaigning against or for a ban on deep sea mining. And for campaigners, this is really, what have I done here? Okay, but for campaigners, this is really a heart and soul struggle, to protect our ocean, our livelihoods, our well-being, and our very way of life. Now, how do I go? Yeah, okay. So campaigners in the region against DSM are based, their concerns are based on realistic anticipation of realistic impacts that will come from deep sea mining. The impacts on our fisheries, which Helen's already explained, putting at risk Pacific people's food security, their livelihoods, and their whole way of life, as I said. A majority of people in our region, I should explain, depend on subsistence livelihoods. This is one region of the world where people still own their land under communal ownership systems. And so the sea and the ocean is really a vital source of their food supply. They live off the ocean and what they can plant on the land that they own communally. We're also very concerned about deep sea mining's very likely impacts on the already very destabilized climate system, because if deep sea mining, as we expect it will, affects or interferes with the ocean systems of storing or sequestering carbon, you'd have you'd have it trigger possibly an intensified climate crisis. The ocean is the planet's largest carbon sink. Our communities are on the front line, as you know, or probably know, of sea level rise, particularly the low-lying atoll states. And we are the most vulnerable when it comes to things like extreme weather events. We've been having more frequent tropical cyclones of increased intensity, like, Category 5 cyclones. As oceanic people, we also have a responsibility, as we in the campaign see it, to protect our ocean, which we've inhabited, which we've intimately known, traversed, and respected for centuries. We have a obligation or moral responsibility to protect the richness of the ocean's marine life, to protect marine biodiversity, and to protect against the risk of accelerated an accelerated climate crisis, as I said. Okay, this is a photograph. You might wonder why I'm showing this when this slide is really talking about DSM campaign that began in PNG after the license was given to Nautilus Minerals. It's already been covered by Helen and also by Jonathan, and so has the point that the licenses remain there. We don't know how many there are, but the campaign is not over. The struggle is not over, because those licenses could be bought by another company, and Solwara 1 may go ahead. But this photograph was taken back in 2012, I believe. That's Maureen Penguelli on the left and Nolene Nambulivo. These are two early campaigners. Maureen's been campaigning. She's with PANG, the Pacific Network on Globalization, which was one of the founding organizations in the Pacific Blue Line campaign. But this was in Rio that they were demonstrating, and back then saying stop ocean crime, say no to experimental seabed mining. And this is Jonathan again, who you've already met, and that's a copy of the petition, I believe, or a letter to the government asking for a cancellation of all DSM licenses. Okay, so PNG we've already covered. There are 4 Pacific Island countries which have exploration tenements in the EEZ. And I'll come to them shortly. But this, the Cook Islands is a country, a small island state in the Pacific, which is currently engaged in pursuing deep sea mining within its EEZ. And so concerned Cook Islanders are currently engaged in a very strong campaign against DSM in their territorial waters or seabed. Interestingly, Cook Islands has the largest marine protected area in the Pacific, the Marae Moana, but its government is nonetheless pursuing these plans to mine the polymetallic nodules on their seabed. 3 companies have submitted applications for exploration licenses through what appears to be or seems to be a transparent process, but it isn't really. There's been criticisms by members of the public who've been submitting comments on those applications. The companies that get the okay to do exploration in their waters will be producing an environmental impact assessment. Te Ipukarea Society, which is a environmental NGO, calls for more independent assessment of the environment on the deep seabed. They're also campaigning for a moratorium, a 10-year moratorium, to align with the UN Decade of Ocean Science. And TIS has traveled by traditional traditional double-hulled canoe, Vaka, to 14 islands in the country to provide further information, and particularly as the community consultations that the government has been carrying out has been simple, more emphasizing the economic benefits and also telling Cook Islanders how very rich they will become through deep sea mining. In 2016, the Cook Islands also sponsored a Belgian company, GSR, to acquire an exploration tenement in the CCZ. And there's you can't see it, but there's a link to a film that you might want to see later. Okay, whoops. Sorry, I'm going backwards. Just let me check this. I think Tonga's the next slide. I don't know how to do this. Oh, it's the return button? No, it doesn't. Okay, so Tonga is one of the 4 Pacific Island ISA members countries that has sponsored a company to explore with a view to mining the seabed and the CCZ. It became a sponsoring state of Deep Green, now the metals company, through that company's acquisition of TOMIL, Tonga, was it Overseas Mining Limited? Offshore Mining Limited, I think it is. And that company was established by Nautilus Minerals. Sorry, the company was acquired by Nautilus Minerals, Inc., which had secured an exploration tenement in the CCZ through Tonga's sponsorship. TMC may also have acquired Nautilus Minerals licenses to explore the seabed in Tonga's EEZ as well. And I've just got a point there saying that Deep Green, the metals company, is a shady shapeshifter. Its leaders were key figures in Nautilus Minerals before it declared bankruptcy, leaving Papua New Guinea with a huge debt. And you know, it changed its name to the metals company after it was acquired by, or it merged with SOAC, Sustainable Opportunities Acquisition Corporation, I think is what it stands for. Tonga's constitution doesn't oblige the government to actually consult with its people on, you know, things like entering or providing contracts to a corporation, and doesn't require them to reveal any details of contracts with foreign investors. So it's made very difficult, the campaign against deep sea mining that Tonga is involved in. But the very strong NSA or CSO group within Tonga, the Civil Society Forum of Tonga, has been just, fighting a Herculean battle and campaign, putting on a really strong fight in Tonga, and also with the ISA. And they really are a tremendous campaign group. Oops. Okay, Nauru. Nauru, I'm calling Nauru the poster child of the race by global North mining companies to mine the deep seabed in the CCZ, because they have triggered this 2-year rule, which Duncan, I think, will explain. But Nauru, it's an interesting case because Nauru itself is a victim of devastating colonial resource extraction that left 90% of central Nauru a wasteland. That's Nauru's government's own term. They talk about it as 90% of the central Nauru as a wasteland. And the country has basically become almost destitute. It's one of those, what do they call it? The ironies of actually being resource rich and ending up actually with, being pretty poverty stricken. And the what was mined in Nauru was phosphate. And Nauru's offer to be one of Australia's 2 offshore processing centres for asylum seekers also brought it to global attention and earned it really disrepute because human rights abuses at the centre were exposed. And the Australian media quite cruelly depicted Nauru as a hellhole. But, Nauru's in the forefront. It's basically, hoping to jumpstart deep sea mining in the CCZ. And as I said, Duncan will probably speak more about that. Kiribati, interesting country as well. It has the largest EEZ of the independent Pacific Island states. If you count those countries that are still, in my view, colonies, French Polynesia has the largest EEZ. But Kiribati set up the Phoenix Island Protection Area in 2006. This was under the presidency of Anoti Tong, who became very close friends with Conservation International's chief ocean scientist, Greg Stone, at the time. And I think Greg Stone was, a ally and assisted with bringing PIPA about. Greg Stone is now Deep Green, the metal company's chief scientist, ocean scientist. PIPA was hailed as a major achievement. It was listed on UNESCO's World Heritage sites, or one of the heritage sites. It didn't receive the financial support that it expected to receive through the establishment of an associated conservation trust fund. And currently, Kiribati's government, the government of the present, is delisting or considering delisting PIPA as a World Heritage Site and opening it up to commercial fishing, which
Claire,
is to say,
Claire, excuse me, Claire.
Okay, I'm running out of time. Okay,
you have 2 minutes to wrap up. We can give
okay, let me just go. I really want to get to the 2 slides at the end. What's happened here? No, not from the start. Yeah, okay, so yeah, and this is just a slide Helen's shown you it already on the Pacific Blue Line Collective, which consists of a number of Fiji-based but regional NGOs, okay? I just want to talk about the political dynamics, and there are 2 slides. Pacific Island countries or states were primed for participating in deep sea mining. Back in, I can't remember whether it was 2012 or 2014, the European Union funded a DSM project through the South Pacific Commission, which is a regional organization through its geoscience division. And this was to help them prepare for participating in DSM. And they held consultations and they helped, and this was critical, draft regulatory legislation. Several people who were associated with that project are now with ISA or connected with Deep Green, the metal company, or otherwise supporting DSM. There's little prospects today for any united regional position on DSM. We have the new appointee as the Secretary General in the Pacific Island Forum's Secretariat, Henry Puna, who was previously Cook Island Prime Minister, he's a very strong advocate of DSM. So, you know, there's no way that one's going to be able to use PIFs. There are 4 Pacific Island countries then pursuing DSM interests, 3 Pacific Island countries which are advocating, or governments that are advocating a moratorium. There are also other divisions within the Pacific or amongst Pacific Island states at the moment. The Micronesian states have withdrawn from the Pacific Island Forum I won't go into it unless people are interested. And there's also a division amongst states in another regional body, the University of the South Pacific. And there's no DSM concerns shown as yet from regional fisheries bodies like the PNA and the Foreign Fisheries Agency, even though, as Helen points out, you know, there's a risk to affecting this very, very lucrative resource in the Pacific and a major income earner for many states. There are states in the parties to the, jeepers. Okay, second slide, here we are, and slideshow from this one. Oh, Lord. Can you see that?
Yes, Claire, we can see it. No problem.
Current slide, okay. So the second slide, I'm just raising the concerns about DSM, you know, summarizing them. For CCZ, mining in the CCZ, the issue of transboundary harm and of liability for Pacific Island states that are sponsoring states. The liability, as I understand it, and Duncan can clarify, is shared between contractors and sponsoring states. Sponsoring states are responsible, though, for controlling the contractors. And that means actually that their national legislation, their regulations really must be watertight. There's no evident support from ISA to ensure that sponsoring states are equipped to be effectively able to control the contractors, nor protection from being hung out to dry by contractors. The returns to sponsoring states are really minuscule. And, you know, really the question has to be asked, did UNCLOS really envisage a system of developing states being used by profiteering companies to access the area, you know, and the common heritage of humankind? ISA, as an intergovernmental organization of member states, should act to ensure protection of member states, not facilitate, you know, companies getting their hands on these resources, which unfortunately, in my view, is what they seem to be doing. For mining in their EEZs, there are concerns about environmental impacts, social impacts within territorial waters, and communities, which, you know, have already been alluded to, but also a concern about transboundary harm. You know, Helen's talked about sediment plumes. These may well affect, fisheries and food supplies and so forth. The possible clauses in exploration contracts that might oblige states to issue mining licenses after exploration has been done is also a concern. We don't know that there are such clauses, but, you know, we worry that there might be. There's also worries about the inclusion of ISDS clauses, the investor state dispute settlement clauses, in contracts which states in the Pacific may sign with companies that go into mine, because, you know, these clauses usually allow states, as you may know, allow companies to sue states if any legislation or policy is taken that affects the expected profits to be made. So these sorts of worries about the non-transparency and the, you know, secretive kind of way in which contracts are drawn up. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. And so let's hear it from Duncan. Duncan?
Yeah.
Duncan, we're not hearing your audio.
You think you know by now? Hello, I'll start again. Yes, it's a great pleasure. Thank you, Chadwick, and it's a pleasure to speak to you all. Following Helen and Claire's great presentations, I'm just really going to focus on 2 issues. Firstly, to dispel some myths, why we don't need deep sea metals, and secondly, why the Seabed Authority needs reform.
The Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, which I represent, has about 90 non-governmental organizations concerned with protection of the deep sea, and there's some of them there. A few key points that there is no, and you heard this from Helen as well, there is simply no need to open a new extractive frontier. A circular economy can reduce the demand for virgin metals. New battery technologies are entering the market that do not require deep sea minerals, and seabed mining will not replace terrestrial mining, it will simply add to it. And when we hear from the proponents of seabed mining, we hear a lot about, oh, we're going to help the sustainable development. What you don't hear is either the compliance with SDG 14 Target 2, that by 2020, which has come and gone, they'll sustainably manage and protect marine and coastal ecosystems to avoid significant adverse impacts. And talk about healthy and productive oceans. Well, that won't happen. And most crucially, Sustainable Development Goal 12 requires sustainable consumption and production patterns with a target to substantially reduce waste generation through prevention, reduction, recycling, and reuse. This is where the world's going now. In the days of a climate crisis and biodiversity crisis, it just simply isn't acceptable to open a new extractive industry. And it's not necessary either. This slide just shows some very large companies, Google, BMW, Volvo, have all backed the environmental call for pause in seabed mining. The world's second biggest car maker has gone nickel and cobalt free. So we hear a great deal from the metals company that you heard about from Helen and from Claire saying, oh, well, you know, we're going to need 1 billion cars with cobalt and nickel by 2040. Even now, companies are moving away from cobalt and nickel. And just showing here, Microsoft has a moratorium on using minerals from deep seabed mining, and a number of other large financial institutions have also declared their opposition to seabed mining. And these companies, again, BMW, Philips, Volvo, Volkswagen, Scania, they're very large companies, Google, have all called on governments to support a global moratorium on deep seabed mining. And just to finish up what I said before, you know, quite frankly, and all of you will appreciate, we don't know what the technology is going to be in a couple of years. We certainly don't know what's going to be in 20, 30 or 40 years, which is the kind of timeframes we hear from the metals company. And mining contracts will be in place for at least 30 years with automatic 10-year renewal. So we're really talking a minimum of 40, 50, 60 years per seabed mining operation. And just noting here, all entry-level Tesla Model 3 and Model Y electric vehicles will have lithium iron phosphate LFP batteries. And again, the Chinese manufacturer BYD is using lithium iron phosphate, which again don't have nickel, do not have cobalt. And I'm going to leave this topic with the words of the metals company's predecessor, SOAC, who actually told the Securities and Exchange Commission, and I'll talk about this why shortly, it may also not be possible to determine whether the impact of nodule collection on global biodiversity will be less significant than those estimated for land-based mining for a similar amount of produced metal. So for all the narratives they spin and for all the public relations, when it comes to actually having to tell the truth, to raise money on the stock exchange, this is the kind of truth that they finally will tell you. Okay, turning to the International Seabed Authority and the structure, this slightly complicated map perhaps, it gives you an idea that you, following on from states, and you see on the left-hand side, you have what's called the continental shelf, which goes at least to 200 nautical miles from the coastline, but up to 350 potentially nautical miles. Beyond that is the deep sea called the area, and that is also known as area beyond national jurisdiction. That is the area which is controlled by the International Seabed Authority. And you've heard about this from Helen, so I won't talk about this. But currently, the ISA is actually meeting right now. I've been attending it all this week in Jamaica. It's been meeting both virtually and physically in a not very well attended series of meetings. Potentially the assembly, which is all of the world's members, and it's pretty much all the world's countries, comprise the assembly, which is theoretically the supreme organ. In reality, most of the work is done by something called the council, which there are 36 members of the council elected by a very complex formula. And the Legal and Technical Commission is a very shadowy organization I'm going to tell you about shortly, which has 30 individuals elected by the council. And there's a secretariat, which is tightly controlled by its Secretary General, Michael Lodge. And a little bit about seabed mining. I think you've heard this from Helen, so I won't dwell on this. So I'll just move on to some structural and political concerns with the Seabed Authority. I think first and foremost really is a lack of transparency. For example, contracts are not made public. They have started to release what are called templates with some details, but not the full contracts. We had an extraordinary conversation today with the chairman of the Legal and Technical Commission, still trying to justify holding closed meetings totally behind closed doors. As far as I'm aware, they've only ever had 2 1 or 2 hour open meetings in their entire existence. Yet when they were specifically asked by the Assembly, the supreme organ, in 2017 to hold open meetings, they just ignored it. And as I said, even today, literally today, when questioned by 3 or 4 countries, including Germany, Belgium, the United Kingdom, Costa Rica, he simply denied the need to be transparent and said, oh, we've got to make difficult decisions. So that's one of the biggest problems, but it's not the only problem, because also, I'll get into transparency shortly, actually. The second thing I want to say is that in 1994, there was concern, for want of a better word, by the developed world that they did not reach a good deal in 1982 when they concluded the Law of the Sea Convention. So they concluded what's called a 1994 implementing agreement. And that implementing agreement completely changed the voting mechanism, took power away from the developing countries and gave it to the developed countries, and made a 2-house system effectively. So rather than having the Assembly making the final decisions, it made the council body, which again is the body which is comprised of, for example, countries that are reliant on the exploitation of minerals and the countries that have spent most on seabed mining get crucial votes. And so, for example, if a contract for seabed mining for exploitation in the future is to be sent to the International Seabed Authority for approval, if the Legal and Technical Commission, which, as I said, meets behind closed doors and is heavily weighted towards the mining industry, if the LTC recommends that the contract be approved, it requires a 2/3 vote of the council to overturn that recommendation, including all of the chambers of the council, which may, in practical terms, it's pretty much impossible. So the LTC is a very powerful body. And also the Seabed Authority is in many ways not only the regulator, is also beneficiary of the licenses that is paid for the revenue, $500,000, for example, per exploration contract. Right now there are 31. If and when seabed mining starts, they will receive royalties directly. And at the same time, there's an extraordinary provision where the Seabed Authority can even be a seabed miner. It's called the enterprise. And we were even discussing this today. So they can actually go out and seabed mine themselves as the International Seabed Authority and regulate themselves at the same time. It really is quite extraordinary. And lastly, so there is a major bureaucratic and institutional momentum to mine. And frankly, going to Seabed Authority meetings is a whole different world. You know, you think there'd be a serious debate. In reality, apart from a handful of states holding up for the common heritage of mankind and for the environment, you have the vast majority of states simply saying to the Seabed Authority, yep, go ahead, let's start seabed mining. Helen and Clara both talked about the 2-year rule. This is an obscure clause added in these negotiations I told you about in 1994. And what they say is that if regulations are not yet adopted for exploitation, and right now they are not, then the sponsoring state, so in which case it is Nauru, the sponsoring state for this company, the metals company, or used to be called Deep Green, all they've got to do is write a letter to the Seabed Authority saying, we want to go seabed mining. They did that in June 30 of this year. So they have, the Seabed Authority now, in theory, has until June 30, 2023 to adopt regulations. And this is where it gets really extraordinary. If they do not adopt regulations by that time, then they must nevertheless consider and adopt the request for a seabed mining contract from the contractor, in this case is TMC's subsidiary NORI, even if there are no regulations in place. Again, I say this again, even if there are no regulations in place, this rule says they have to be given a mining contract. Now, there are a lot of legal issues about this, which I won't go into, but I'm happy to talk about them if people are interested. It is very clear, despite all of this wording, that number one, states cannot be forced to approve regulations. So it is quite possible, in fact, I'd say quite likely, that the deadline is missed in June 30. So even though some countries, as a knee-jerk reaction, say, oh, we've been given this 2-year deadline, that is not true. And this is what we're emphasizing. And conversely, what is true is and I really want to hammer this home if you don't remember anything else from the seminar but this, if the regulations are put in place by the International Seabed Authority, seabed mining will start. It's as simple as that. So this is the message from Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, is that the states must not put in place, despite this pressure from Nauru, they must not put into place the regulations by 2023. And there will be a lot of legal issues, and we actually started discussing this in the council this week, and the conversation will be ongoing. Last thing to say is all countries have the equal opportunities to mine, and I'm just posing, can the Seabed Authority really say no if many wish to apply? And this is one of the very real problems, because once Nauru, for example, gets a contract, is the Seabed Authority really going to say no to the United Kingdom, to China, to Russia, to Eastern Europe countries, to Poland, to Belgium, and so on? And so this is a very real concern, and this is the key reason, and I'll say this at the end of this presentation, why a moratorium on seabed mining is absolutely critical, and the 2-year rule has made it even more critical. But I also want to emphasize that what we have seen is a complete corporate takeover of the Seabed Authority system. In theory, and this was the vision of the famous Arvid Pardo, a Maltese diplomat in the 1960s, that the seabed shall be the common heritage of mankind. It was a great idea in those days. What we see now is corporate capture described to you by Helen and by Claire, with Nautilus becoming Deep Green, becoming the metals company. And so you have a company which is now listed on the stock exchange in New York with subsidiaries in Nauru, Tonga, and Kiribati, all of which have reserved areas intended for developing countries. So a complete corporate takeover. And there are some technical issues. I won't have much time to talk about them, but again, very happy to talk about them later on if there's time. The system requires effective control. In other words, if you are a sponsoring state, such as Nauru, you are meant to have effective control over the Nauru subsidiary called NORI, or in Tonga, you're meant to have effective control over TOML. They don't. The control has got to be presumably in New York. No one's tested that. There's a lot of difficult legal questions, but you have a publicly listed company based in New York. It seems to any interested observer or uninterested observer who looks at the Seabed Authority, looks at the law, and looks at the convention, that effective control must be in New York. So what we're seeing really is illegal. Liability, and this was even an issue raised by Nauru back in 2011, but it is very much a two-edged sword. And Kiribati, for example, is very exposed because of the way that their arrangement with the metals company is structured, that quite frankly, they're left with the liability. And this is the situation we saw with Papua New Guinea. They ended up being out of pocket for over $100 million. There's a very serious possibility that, again, these countries are ending up holding the can for liability. And finally, on this issue, the vast majority of the profits will go to the contractors. They are demanding at least a 17% return on capital, which is an extraordinarily high return. That's what they say because it's so risky. They require 17%. And under estimates made by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, contractors would get over half the revenues, being about $10 billion over the life of the contract. They say the sponsoring state would get $3 billion. Very unlikely, as Helen and Claire have said, what we're seeing in Tonga, and we've seen the figures, it's a tiny, tiny fraction of that. And the International Seabed Authority will get $2 or $3 billion over 30 years. Now, even if you take that figure and you divide it by 30 years, you end up with a few $100,000 a year. Sorry, it's covered by the picture, but this is not going to make anyone rich. And what's really happened with the developing world, particularly the African countries who don't have an extra grind, if you like, it's become painfully clear that this common heritage of mankind is a myth, that there's no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, if you like, and that's really has focused them on wanting to get involved with the enterprise because they can see they're not going to get any money from the current system. And just on this issue, I just want to leave you with, on this issue, with a quote by SOAC again to the Securities and Exchange Commission. We cannot predict how long these studies will take, the scientific studies, whether the environment and biodiversity is impacted by our activities, and if so, how long the environment and biodiversity will take to recover. In addition, it is unknown how effectively mitigation strategies can prevent potential biodiversity loss and species extinctions. Again, this is in the own words of the metals company's predecessor, SOAC. So it really is the metals company's own words. Now, just a few words on this. I've talked about the LTC meeting behind closed doors. There are other incredibly concerning issues. A lot of policy at the Seabed Authority is developed by workshops. For those workshops, they have very tightly controlled agendas. So the kind of issues really that Claire was talking about, very restricted public participation. Speakers are hand-picked by the International Seabed Authority Secretariat in Jamaica. Even the reports are hand-picked. I went to one workshop a couple of years ago where I found out by mistake that there actually were two workshops going on. One was the workshop I was at, and a second workshop of 3 or 4 people, which actually wrote the report. That's the kind of games that they play. And this is because the Secretariat and Secretary General Michael Lodge really is ideologically determined to make sure seabed mining starts. And I've got one recent quote this year where he said he told an international forum. Duncan, 2 minutes, thank you. Yep. The international negotiations are increasingly confronted with extreme ideological positions, including a growing environmental extremism and dogmatism bordering on fanaticism in some instances. So those are the words of the Secretary General. And only this week, or last week I should say, the ISA published a paper expressly requesting countries to start debating against NGOs in favor of seabed mining. They basically said, we're losing the PR battle. We want countries to step up and start debating it. So an openly hostile secretariat to NGOs. Very few southern states have NGOs participating, and at the same time, a very biased secretariat. So yes, to wrap up, the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition is calling for a moratorium until all environmental, social, and economic risks are comprehensively understood. The mining can be managed to ensure effective protection of the marine environment and there's no loss of biodiversity. Free, prior, informed consent of Indigenous peoples and communities, that all alternatives have been fully explored and applied, that there is broad and informed public support secured, and that mining fulfills the obligation to benefit humankind as a whole, and there is comprehensive reform of the Seabed Authority for a transparent, accountable, inclusive, and environmentally responsible rather decision-making and regulatory process. And we actually had some very good news today that Guam actually is the first large territory, not technically a country, but they're a very important Pacific player, have even today announced that they support an international moratorium on seabed mining in the area. So hopefully they're the first of many. And thank you very much. And back to you, Siswati.
Thank you, Duncan. So I think we're on the open forum part of our program. What we're going to do is to ask everyone who has a question to raise their hand so we can acknowledge you. We'll probably do this because we have limited time. A context and then your main question, please. Or you can use the chats as well. And to whom is it addressed to, for that matter?
Chadwick Clancy has one question in the chat box.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, Clancy. I did not see it. But yes, ahead. Go ahead, Clancy, and say it if you want.
Oh, sure. Thank you for the 3 presentations. They were very informative, and I feel like my knowledge alone has increased a lot by listening to you. So I really appreciate you taking the time. I was just wondering, in terms of the ISA, who has the power to influence that body? You know, if we were thinking about a sort of, you know, regional or global campaign strategy, who should we be targeting to ensure that, you know, deep sea mining doesn't take place in the next few years?
How's the chat, Chadwick?
I think that should be Duncan's.
Okay, thank you, Chadwick. Thank you, Clancy, for the question. Very good question, Clancy. The key issue are the 36 states of the council, because they're the ones who have to make the decision either to adopt regulations or not by the end or middle of 2023, as well as to whether or not to grant a contract to the metals company. Happy to later on, if the organisers, I'm happy to give out my email address to give you the names of what those countries are. But yeah, there's quite a significant number of them. Some of the key ones, the European countries are under pressure. I think Germany has recently had an election, of course, and the Greens have a lot more power. We saw a lot more moderate statements from Germany, if I can say that, and even the same with Belgium. And these are both sponsoring states. The United Kingdom is a tough nut to crack. We need to move them along. France is an interesting one. They've been very, very unhelpful this week in the Seabed Authority, but from first principles, Macron should be supportive. And one of the best examples, I think, is of how things were changed was in the 1990s. There was to be an Antarctic minerals regime called CRAMRA, and there was a major NGO lobbying campaign to stop ratification. And finally, that was successful, and France and Australia said, "Okay, you know, we agree," and they put into place something called the Madrid Protocol. So one of the things that the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition is very focused on is getting like-minded states together, and form, because one of the problems we have is no state even the more progressive states don't want to come out and say we want a moratorium until the others do. So we need a critical mass to get this moving along. So that's the last thing I would say. I wouldn't only focus attention on the council states, because if we can get other significant states to support a moratorium, that will empower others to be stronger. And Fiji, for example, is very sympathetic. Papua New Guinea, partly because of the problems that they've had. Their experience, Vanuatu are 3 Pacific countries, which I think could well be in the front of the queue, even together with Federated States of Micronesia, for example. And African countries are in a difficult position. Again, they need the revenue, they need the money. They think they may get it from the enterprise, but they also know the system is rigged against them. So yeah, I hope that gives you a few ideas.
Okay. Any more questions coming from our participants? Feel free. Although Siswati, I don't know if there's anyone from the chat box. I'm not seeing anyone. Some more questions before we properly thank our panelists. Okay, you may want to raise your hand. There's an issue here because I'm just trying to get this off my mind right now. There is a really, if I'm going to say this, there is a kind of a, you know, accountability taking from rich countries, coming from, you know, the people who are, well, of course, there are questions here, so I'm going to hold on that thought for a bit. There is a question by, and I'm struggling with my chat box, but there is a question coming.
Should I read out?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Isn't there's a question from Barry, who is the legal and technical committee and who is on it? And there is one more question from Sridhar. Any information on the role of India in ISA currently?
Okay. I guess I should take these.
Yes, of course, Duncan, and then if Claire and Helen has anything to add, yes, please.
Do you want to go first, Helen? And
Duncan, you may start with that.
Okay, I'll start. You fill in the gaps, please.
Right.
Okay, on Legal and Technical Commission, that's 30 members elected by the council, and they are predominantly geologists. I think well over half of them are geologists by training. And quite honestly, these are people who want to scrape the green stuff off so they can get to the rocks, to be a bit facetious, but unfortunately it's true. There are only 3 biologists on the Legal and Technical Commission. In theory, they are elected in their personal capacity, not to represent their country. But in fact, you do have some there that are from countries with contractors, and so they have a conflict of interest there as well. And in theory, you'll hear some say, "Oh, they're only an advisory body." And if you read the Law of the Sea Convention in a narrow sense, that's what it may look like. But I gave in quite extensive detail the voting problems, and you need 2/3 of a vote to overrule a recommendation by the Legal and Technical Commission. So therefore, countries who are involved know that it's important. So what we have now is a very intense battle, and it's been going on this week as well, as to whether the LTC elections should be based on geographical representation, which of course the South wants, or by by technical expertise, which is what the North wants. And so it really is very much a North-South proxy battle, which is far from resolved at the moment. But at the moment, we really are seeing them, I have to be blunt, they're controlled to a large extent by the Secretariat, who controls the flow of information, the meetings, what happens. And so the reality is that I'd like to say they're independent. In reality, I think they'll largely do what the Secretariat wants. So that's the Legal and Technical Commission. And I should add that the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition and other organizations, NGOs, have consistently called for a scientific committee to be established. It's absolutely crazy that there was no scientific committee in the ISA. It was simply because it was set up in the 1980s and they hadn't thought about it then, I suppose. But nowadays, you wouldn't dream of setting up an organization without a scientific committee. Yet we've been talking about it for over 10 years now. Belgium made some moves to try to make that happen. They then watered it down into a suggestion of having independent scientists. And even that was knocked on the head. So, yeah, the LTC is a very real problem. And the, sorry, what was the other question, Chadwick?
What is
India? India, thank you. Yeah. Unfortunately, India is a bit of a problem as well. India wants to, they have some contracts for seabed mining. They conducted a seabed mining test, I think about, late last year. They did require public consultation, or they did offer public consultation after they were requested to extend a 6-week period. So a lot of NGOs put in some significant comments on the environmental impact assessment. However, as far as we can see, they're completely ignored, and they went ahead and did their test. Lately, they've said they want to mine in in very deep water, 6,000 meter water, which would be very, very technologically challenging. But normally their contribution is generally pro-seabed mining in the Seabed Authority.
Thank you so much. Helen, Claire, are there?
There is one question, Chadwick, in the chat box.
Right, I'm seeing it now.
Nishant is asking, any specific talks on deep sea mining and greenwashing in recently concluded COP26?
Okay, yeah. Helen, do you have information about this, or Claire, that you can share as well, and Duncan, maybe?
Is the question about the official COP talks,
well,
or the side?
Definitely, if there had been a topic breached within COP regarding DSM in particular, has this been a topic within the recent?
I'm not sure that there was, but there was plenty on the, came up in several NGO meetings, which I know Saswati attended at least one of them, and Claire was a speaker at one called the Pacific Talanoa, and Saswati could probably forward the links to that particular talk. There were also others that the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition were very active at COP, so Duncan may have more to add on that.
Not really. I mean, there was, there certainly was a discussion and a debate in the side events. I think not on the floor of the COP, but as Helen said, in the side events and the Talanoa in particular, which was very powerful. So yes, there was talk about it.
I'm interested, Claire, because the topic of greenwashing is pretty good question as well. What does greenwashing look like in DSM anyway?
Well, the spin. So I suppose we alluded to some of the spin. The spin that there is no life on the deep sea. It's an ecological desert. So if we mess up the deep sea, it doesn't really matter. No one's going to be affected by that because people don't live down there and it's so remote from everything. So, the counter to that is obviously that the ocean is a huge, vast interconnected realm. It's connected by currents and by species moving up and down through the ocean and horizontally in the ocean, and chemical cycles, including carbon cycles. And Claire talked about, being the biggest carbon sink on the planet, so carbon is sequestered into the seabed as well. Other forms of deep sea mining, as Duncan sort of talked about, of the spin, is, that we won't be able to society won't be able to reach the goal of a carbon neutral future without deep sea mining, that deep sea mining is, totally essential for this. So, which ignores the fact there are other sources of minerals from recycling, the vast waste piles that I know, in Australia we dump in Thailand, and other countries in Europe dump in Ghana, and India probably has its fair share of waste, electronic waste being dumped by first world countries as well. Those represent a huge resource to be tapped into, and should be tapped into before we entertain the idea of destroying another habitat.
Right.
The companies are going to make their countries will make lots of money out of it, as Claire discussed. That's another part of their spin. They're likely to make very little out of it. And they could be held liable for significant damages. Once the impacts occur from deep sea mining, there could be, fisheries bodies and that sue deep sea mining companies. There could be tourism bodies that sue deep sea mining companies. So there could be significant liabilities associated with deep sea mining, and the countries that sponsor the companies could find themselves, not at a profit, but at a significant loss.
Okay.
And what are some of the other important key spins, Claire and Duncan?
Okay. Before we go to Duncan and Claire, I'm going to take in 2 more questions, just walking at the time. And then after that, we might probably have to wrap up. This is an exciting panel, and I'm sure there should be follow-ups for this if it's what's good for us. I'm sure of it. So Duncan, yes, I'm sure you're going to add to that, but briefly, if
I was only going to add that probably one of the biggest greenwash or spin is that we need, and that's why I spent a lot of time in my presentation showing why it's a myth, that we need to mine the deep sea to power the renewables revolution. That is the absolute story that Jared Barron, the CEO of Deep Green and now the metals company, tries to spin. And frankly, they've been very successful. They can spend hundreds of millions of dollars on public relations, and probably not a day goes by when I don't have this put to me by a journalist. And frankly, it's absolute rubbish. Right now, for example, when you talk about nickel, the vast majority of nickel is used for stainless steel, for example. A lot of cobalt is used for jet engines. Well, so you may as well say that we need to mine the deep sea so we can make nuclear missiles. They just choose to say we need to mine the deep sea so we can make electric vehicles, which, as I explained, car companies are rapidly moving to batteries which don't require cobalt or nickel. So and lastly, I even heard today from one country in the Seabed Authority, oh well, you're just anti-mining. I say to you, don't even get out of bed because we all need minerals. Well, none of us saying don't use minerals. What we are saying, reuse, recycle, be smarter about your use of minerals. So the knee-jerk reaction, again, we need things, we've got to go to the deep sea, just doesn't wash anymore with planetary boundaries. And so, they've been very successful in that. And yes, we need to be ever vigilant to try to get journalists and members of government officials and so on to realize it's just rubbish. It's just pure spin. And last thing I want to say is Deep Greens will then go on and see they try to look like environmentalists. They'll even say, oh, we're only going to mine until we've got enough metals to power the revolution, the renewables revolution, and then we'll be part of a circular economy. At the same time as they're saying that, they're moving behind the scenes of the Seabed Authority to say 30 years isn't enough, 40 years isn't enough, and they've talked about 60 or 70-year contracts. So what they're really saying is they're going to mine the deep sea for 70 years.
Okay, thank you, Duncan. I think Shredar's question regarding IUCN and WWF had been answered in the chat as well. So I'd like to... yes, Claire, for a while. Yes, Claire, sure.
That's one of the reasons that we had a webinar on the sidelines, if you like, of COP26, because it was not on the official agenda. And it's really strange that actually the climate crisis people not actually seen the link to, what's happening with the oceans. As James Bhagwan of the Pacific Conference of Churches, which is one of the partners to the Pacific Blue Line campaign, said, you can't have climate justice without ocean justice. But, we were really kind of addressing climate campaigners and climate warriors to take on board, basically the whole issue of DSM, given the link between, it's like these two kind of, what you might say, the global commons are just being looked at quite separately, discreetly. You've got the oceans over there and you've got the climate system over there, and not really seeing that DSM really threatens the climate system.
Right. Thank you so much, everyone. So I think it's my job to see if I can, cap up what had been discussed this afternoon without going very lengthy about it. I'd like to take Claire's image of the ocean as a binding body that connects the whole world, for that matter, and that for over a long time, we as a people, human beings, had used this bodies of water to connect with each other, our history and our culture touching one humanity to the other. Therefore, we have a stake in deep sea mining. And the discussions would eventually veer towards, is deep sea mining relatable to the Sustainable Development Goals? Of course, Duncan and I think all of us would agree that definitely would not support Sustainable Development Goals. The impacts, as Helen had discussed, would, because it is not fully understood, and therefore why venture into a big potential harm that we have not even understood as well. And so the recommendation for moratorium runs very clear. Claire insists passionately in her presentation that there is a common heritage for the human family, and that heritage belongs to the sea. I mean, the sea belongs to that common heritage as well, and so we need to take care of it. The issues that had been shared by, expressed by our panelists today ranges from the most basic right to participate in a governing body. The question needs to be begged. Why, this begs the question, why would a very small group of people decide for the whole human race without even making sure that this kind of participation is shared multilaterally by many people? You see descriptions there like a secretariat that's not really talkative about the information given. And so I think as part of the Asia Pacific concerns, you see the Pacific as the most robust area of being open to deep sea mining at this time, would be to make sure that in practice, our government leaders would also be able to put our agenda into the ISA discussions right now. And at the same time, ensure at some ways, how do we do that? That's one question that we need to answer. How do we do a collective action to make sure that whatever our legal frameworks governing deep sea mining are revisited to affirm the very basic criteria of participation and engagement within bodies that regulate, because there are questions of the capacity of such a regulatory body to be able to say yes or no whenever that is asked for. And so ways forward, I've listed a few, but one of that really, Swati, is to ensure probably that we have more extensive discussions, because 15 minutes per topic is not really enough. And then, of course, such would be a very beautiful initiative. Looking forward to that. But more so, again, how would we position ourselves as Asia Pacific coalitions of civil society to the call for a moratorium, as Duncan did suggest. At the same time, of course, if we are going to revisit the legal framework, what are these really extensively? I myself, I'm just seeing those kinds of legal framework myself. In country, what kind of advocacy asks are we going to do? The mobilization that we will eventually do in order to make sure that our leaders will be able to represent us as constituency, as holders of, well, in democracy, the power that is emanated by the people. And of course, an emphasis, and this is the emphasis shared by all of our speakers, really to come up with the working process, method of participation, engagement, inclusion in the decision-making body that would look at, regulate, and even issue tenurial instruments in deep sea mining. And so I think that's the whole beauty of our discussions this afternoon. Swati.
Thank Thank you. Thank you so much, Chadwick. And thank you to all our speakers, Helen, Claire, and Duncan. It was very insightful indeed. And of course, we definitely didn't do justice by giving you 15 minutes each to kind of, have those discussions. Probably we would definitely have a lot of follow-up discussions ahead. And something that I would like to share, that I read it somewhere in the morning today, that there is no alternative to solidarity. And that's so true. So we stand in solidarity with all the ongoing movements that is going on against deep sea mining. And probably that's our responsibility as well in India and the Asia Pacific to kind of join these movements. And thank you so much, Chadwick, for facilitating the panel presentation and keeping us all at the height of our attention for 1.5 hours. And thank you. Of course, I'm very sorry again that we had this technical challenge for the simultaneous Hindi interpretation, but again, thank you, Ramanorji, for doing that fabulous work of typing it out for people who could at least have this Hindi reading. And big thanks to all the participants for contributing to this lively discussion. We'll definitely be in touch, and I'm going to share all the presentations that our panelists have shared. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is a good job for MIRA. That's something.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.